invisible. The message came at 7:04 p.m. Today I'll be late, lots to do. Order something nice for dinner. Mikhail stared at the screen for a long moment. The words hovered in his mind like steam on a bathroom mirror. Temporary, vague, impersonal. Something nice. It had been a while since anything nice had happened on its own. He was still in his work clothes, faded jeans and a navy t-shirt worn thin from too many washes. He scratched his beard absently and dropped his phone onto the kitchen counter. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Even the hum of the fridge felt like it was trying to fill a space it didn't belong to anymore. He moved toward the living room, then paused. A ping echoed from his phone behind him. Curious. He picked it up again, expecting a follow-up message. Instead, a notification from a social media app he barely used. He tapped it without thinking, and that's when the air shifted. A live stream. Unmuted. He nearly clicked away until something familiar caught his eye. His backyard. The lens swayed slightly, laughter in the background. People he half knew, neighbors, acquaintances. And then her. Natalia, his wife, front and center, framed perfectly in golden evening light, champagne glass in hand, laughing in that theatrical, performative way she used with clients and cameras. She was radiant, made up, dressed in something new and black, hair curled just enough to say, "This matters." And then he saw the cake. The camera zoomed clumsily as someone saying, "To Mishesh, to new beginnings." The cake was round, white, expensive looking, icing letters written in cheerful blue. "Happy birthday, Mish." His name, his birthday, today. A tight coldness gripped his chest, not a mistake, not a coincidence, a mockery. He froze for a second. He considered the absurdity. Maybe it was another Misha, a dog maybe, a friend. A joke, but no. The camera caught her again, raising her glass. "To freedom," Natalia said with a smirk, "and to no longer lying to ourselves." A ripple of laughter. Mikhail didn't feel the phone fall from his hand. Didn't feel his body start to move. It was like his limbs belonged to someone else now. He slipped on his sneakers and walked outside, locking the door behind him out of habit. The night was warm, quiet, familiar. From a distance, the house looked cheerful, lit up, alive, but inside it was hollow. As he rounded the corner, the sound of clinking glasses and upbeat music drifted to him, taunting and bright. He kept walking. Toward the noise, toward the light, toward the version of his life where he didn't exist. The closer Mikhail got, the louder the party became. Bursts of laughter, fragments of pop music, the clink of wine glasses. It was a soundscape of celebration, but each note landed like a slap. He turned the corner and saw the backyard. Lanterns glowed above the long table. Bottles of wine and charcuterie boards were arranged like offerings, or near strangers, milled about in linen shirts and casual dresses, the kind of effortless elegance that always made Mikhail feel slightly underdressed. A white balloon drifted lazily near the gate. The words printed on it caught his eye. "Happy B-Day, Misha." He stopped. His heart wasn't racing. It had slowed. Oddly calm now, like his body had decided to brace itself. He moved closer to the wooden fence. A few voices drifted out, clearly now, like a radio dial settling on a channel. "She's glowing tonight, isn't she? Finally, she's doing what makes her happy. Can you believe she planned all this herself?" Mikhail's fingers curled over the top of the fence. From here, he could see Natalia. She was at the center of it all, holding court. She leaned in to whisper something into Gleb's ear. Gleb, their old friend, the one who used to come over for beers and talk about politics and films. Now he was standing far too close, laughing at something that clearly wasn't funny. Mikhail watched her brush a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way she always did when she wanted to seem playful. That gesture used to be his. He used to notice it in the quiet of their bedroom, her silhouette lit by the soft light of the hallway. Now she did it for him. The gate creaked slightly as he opened it. No one turned. No one noticed. He stepped into the backyard like a ghost slipping into a photograph. The music dimmed, or maybe his ears stopped registering it. All his focus narrowed to Natalia. Then a toast. Someone banged a spoon against a glass. Heads turned toward her. "To freedom," she said again, smiling wide. To honesty, finally. To not pretending anymore. Glasses clanked, a few people cheered, someone whistled, till no one looked at him, except one, an older neighbor, Tatiana. Caught sight of him first. She froze mid-sip, her smile dying in place. Her wine glass lowered slowly and she muttered something to the man beside her. He followed her gaze. So did another. The ripple had begun. Amalia noticed it last. She turned, half laughing, and then stopped. Her expression barely faltered, just a flicker of panic before she tilted her head and gave a crooked smile. "Misha," she said lightly, almost teasing. "You came after all?" Gleb looked down at his glass. Someone shifted uncomfortably. The music stuttered and died. All eyes were on him now. Mikhail said nothing. His gaze moved across the group, faces that suddenly didn't know how to look at him. He wasn't angry, not visibly. He was something colder. Natalia chuckled awkwardly and added, "You should have told me you changed your mind. We'd have saved you a seat." There was no seat. He saw that now. There had never been a seat. He turned, walked through the silence, and closed the gate behind him. Still no words. But behind him, he felt it. The weight of their shame. The awkward resumption of music. The forced laughter. They would return to the party, but it would never fully resume. Not after that. Back on the street, under a pale streetlight, Mikhail kept walking, one slow step after another. It was oddly peaceful out here, away from the noise. He didn't cry. Not yet. That would come later. For now, he just walked. Into the dark, into the truth, into himself. The apartment was too clean. Mikhail stood in the hallway, staring at the neat rows of shoes by the door. Hers lined perfectly, his slightly askew, as if even now he didn't fully belong. The silence pressed in again, dense and watchful. No laughter, no music, just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock that had once hung in their kitchen in St. Petersburg, before the move, before the marriage turned into a contract of quiet neglect. He set his keys down with a click that sounded too loud. Everything felt wrong now, not dramatic or tragic, just off. Like walking into a dream where all the furniture is in the wrong place. His jacket dropped onto the chair. He stood in the center of the living room for a long moment, still, as if waiting for someone to shout, "Surprise!" and undo it all. But no one came. He wandered toward the bookshelf. Most of it was hers, design magazines, novels by French authors he never got into, expensive coffee table books. His things lived at the bottom. Technical manuals, old sketch pads, a dog-eared paperback on the philosophy of structure. He crouched and pulled open the cabinet beneath. Wires, dust, a cracked folder. Light blue with a broken rubber band around it. He hadn't seen it in years. He took it out slowly, his fingers trembling slightly, and sat on the floor, cross-legged, like a child. Inside were photos. Him and Natalia 20 years ago, sitting on the steps of their first apartment. She was wearing his hoodie, smiling lazily, her cheek pressed to his shoulder. He remembered that day. Their first big argument and their first real makeup. They'd walked 5 miles to buy ice cream. She had called it their ugly beautiful day. There were ticket stubs, too, a jazz concert in Prague, a movie premiere he had forgotten she dragged him to, receipts folded into corners, a note he had once left in her lunchbox. "Remember to eat and to breathe, and that I love you, even when I forget how to say it." He stared at the note for a long time, as if reading it might return him to the man who had written it, the man who still believed he mattered. A sharp breath escaped his chest. It wasn't pain, exactly, not like at the party. It was hollowing, like realizing the house you lived in all your life had already been sold to someone else, that every memory had been boxed up and moved out while you weren't looking. He leaned back against the sofa and let the folder rest on his lap. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was how seamless it had been, as if Natalia had rehearsed her new life until he no longer fit into the script. Her laughter tonight, it had no hesitation, no shame, only certainty, the kind that comes when someone's been gone long before they've left. Mikhail rose slowly, folder in hand, and walked into the small, spare room that had become his lately, part office, part hiding place. He sat at his desk and stared at his reflection in the black screen of the monitor. The man looking back seemed unfamiliar. Tired, yes, but something else too, a flicker in the eyes, like a match trying to stay lit in the wind. He turned on the camera. It took a few seconds for the lens to adjust. He looked directly into it. No rehearsed lines, no plan, just breath. He pressed record. "If you're watching this, it means you've made it through. Not just this night, but whatever comes after." He paused. "Today is my 41st birthday. I was supposed to be celebrated. Instead, I watched people I knew toast to my disappearance. I think I always knew, not the details, not the live stream or Gleb or the cake with my name on it, but the feeling. That slow fading, the quiet undoing of we. He swallowed and looked down, then back up. I forgot who I was. For a long time, I made myself small to keep the peace. I thought love meant waiting, forgiving, folding myself into someone else's shape. But here's what I'm starting to believe. Silence is not the same as peace. Disappearing is not the same as being kind. And being loyal doesn't mean accepting less than you deserve. He reached for the photo, the one with her in his hoodie, and held it up to the camera. I loved this person, both of us actually, her and the version of me who believed he could be enough. But now, he set the photo aside. Now it's time to remember someone else. Me, a long pause. Then, softer. Happy birthday, Misha, I see you. He ended the recording. For the first time that day, he felt something settle inside him. Not closure. That would take time. But the beginning of space. Space to breathe, to reclaim, to exist. He didn't know exactly what would come next, only that it would be his. No more backyards where he was a stranger. No more jokes made at his expense. No more being erased. Just the quiet, slow rebuilding of self. And maybe, one day, joy. The next morning came slowly, gray and still. The kind of morning that doesn't ask anything from you. Mikhail sat by the window with a chipped mug of coffee in his hands, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. The street below was empty. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere a neighbor was frying onions, their sharp sweetness cutting through the rain-scented air. He hadn't slept much, but he wasn't exhausted, not anymore. He spent most of the night going through the rest of the box, not in grief, but in curiosity. Like a historian dusting off fragments of a long-forgotten civilization, old text messages printed and folded, boarding passes, a crumpled note Natalia had written once in a hurry, buy lemons. And maybe try smiling more. You used to do that. That note, absurdly small and ordinary, stuck with him. She'd meant it playfully, probably, but even then the message was clear. You're not who you were. Change. Funny how everyone wants you to change, as long as you change into something easier for them. That afternoon, he opened the closet and began to sort his clothes. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. It was time. Some shirts still smelled faintly of her perfume. Others were stiff with time, memories clinging to them like cobwebs. He packed them in silence, folding each item not with sadness, but with purpose. Each sweater, each sock was a decision. This part of me stays, this part doesn't. When he came across a tie she had given him, a deep burgundy one, expensive, never worn, he held it for a moment and then dropped it into the donation pile. He didn't need that version of himself anymore. The man who dressed for her approval, who smiled on command. Later that week, he found himself in a small, second-hand furniture store, the kind that smelled like time. He bought a battered writing desk with a crooked drawer and a brass lamp that reminded him of his grandfather's study. The shopkeeper asked if he needed help loading it into the van. No, Mikhail said simply. I got it. And he did. Back home, he rearranged the spare room, removed the broken printer, pulled down the dusty bookshelf, hung a single framed photograph above the new desk. Not of Natalia, not of any memory they shared, just a photo he'd taken years ago on a solo hiking trip. A winding path in the mountains, lined with golden leaves, disappearing into mist. It had always made him feel something he couldn't name. Now he knew. Solitude, possibility. His own company. For the first time in months, he sat at the desk and opened a blank document. No pressure, no deadline, just the sound of the keys under his fingers and the rain tapping softly on the windowsill. He wrote, not much, just fragments, sentences, thoughts he hadn't let himself think until now. It's easier to vanish than to fight for space. But disappearing costs more than we think. There is no medal for endurance in a one-sided love. Dignity doesn't roar. Sometimes it just quietly walks out the door and doesn't come back. That night, he took a walk. The city felt different. Not kinder, but somehow more honest. The streets weren't interested in his grief, and that oddly was comforting. He passed a group of teenagers laughing too loudly, a woman singing softly to herself at a tram stop, a man feeding pigeons pieces of his sandwich. Everyone was living, moving on, carrying their invisible bags. He wasn't special in his pain. But that also meant he wasn't alone. He ended up at a small cafe he used to frequent years ago before life got tangled. The same old bell rang when he opened the door. It smelled like cinnamon and strong coffee. He ordered a tea and sat by the window, fingers curled around the warm cup. And then, quietly, he took out his phone. No doom scrolling, no social media rabbit holes, just a single file the video he had recorded, his birthday message to himself. He watched it fully this time. No skipping, no flinching. When it ended, he whispered softly, "You made it." The server came by to refill his water. "Celebrating something?" she asked with a smile. He thought for a moment, then nodded. Yes. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street shimmered, slick with reflection. Cars passed. Life continued. But for Mikhail, something had shifted. Not a miracle, not a grand epiphany, just a quiet truth. He had begun the work of unmaking the man who stayed silent too long. And now, brick by brick, moment by moment, he would build something new, not from the wreckage of what was, but from the clarity of what will be. 3 weeks later, Mikhail stood in front of a small mirror, buttoning a clean shirt. No one had told him to dress up. There was no occasion, no formal event, but he felt like marking the day, not for someone else, not to impress or apologize, but for himself. Today, he turned 41. He had woken up in his new apartment, a modest sunlit place on the 5th floor of an old building with creaky floors and generous windows. The kitchen still smelled faintly of paint. A cactus sat crookedly on the windowsill, defiant and small. A warm breeze slipped through the cracked glass, carrying the city's heartbeat in its current. He had no party plan, no guest list, no cake with his name on it. Just one thing, the video. He positioned his phone on a small tripod on the desk and took a seat. The chair creaked slightly under him. He didn't adjust it. He wanted the creak to stay in the recording. Let it be real. He looked into the lens. There was no script. He wasn't here to explain or defend, only to speak. He pressed record. "Today is my birthday," he said, and for the first time, I didn't wait for someone to remember it. No one sent flowers, no one baked a cake, no toasts, no surprise guests, and yet I showed up. I showed up for myself. He let the silence settle, not afraid of the pauses anymore. A few weeks ago, I saw my life from the outside. I stood in a place that used to be mine and realized I was no longer invited to it. That night, I didn't scream. I didn't destroy anything. I walked away, and walking away, not pleading, not fighting, that was the beginning. He inhaled slowly, glancing down at his folded hands. People talk about closure like it's a door you slam, but I think sometimes it's just turning the handle quietly and leaving before you're asked to. There's no dramatic music in real life. Just steps, choices, and sometimes small ones change everything. A faint smile touched the corner of his lips. This video is for me, for the man I used to be, for the one I forgot I was becoming. And maybe, if someone else ever feels like they've been erased, it's for you too. You're not invisible, you're not broken, and you're allowed to begin again. He ended the recording, no applause, no catharsis, just a breath, a quiet release. He uploaded the video to a private folder. Maybe someday he'd share it. Or maybe it would just live there, a marker of a turning point no one else witnessed. Later, he walked down to a small cafe near the station. He took the long route, let himself get lost in the movement of the city, in kids dragging backpacks home from school, in the smell of roasted nuts on the street corner, in the rhythm of passing trams. He ordered black coffee and a slice of cherry pie. The server raised an eyebrow. "Celebrate," he nodded. "Someone's birthday," he said, then paused. "No, actually, just mine," she smiled. "Happy birthday." He sat by the window, sunlight warming his hands. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a guest in his own life. He was home, in himself, and that was enough.